course, but it seems that too many people in our country have apparently forgotten that. And I'm a first generation American, the child of parents who immigrated to this country legally. And the reason that they did so is because, as President Reagan said, America is the last best hope for mankind, a shining city on a hill. That's not just because we have a vibrant economy or a strong military. Those are, of course, necessary, but they're not sufficient. The reason why we are an exceptional country is the foundational principles upon which we were created: a belief and respect for natural rights, due process of law, equal protection, freedom of speech, religion, and expression, the impartial application of justice. They're all protected by law. But seemingly too many people have forgotten or don't understand those principles anymore today, and have instead given into a culture of grievance and victimhood. Mm-hmm. Today, you've seen poll after poll that shows an increase in the number of people who no longer subscribe to an organized religion, particularly amongst younger populations. But it would be a fundamental and profound mistake to suggest that those people no longer have core convictions. As human beings, we're social animals. We're meant to live and seek group acceptance. So instead, what seems to have happened is that a significant component of the population has replaced a belief in organized faith and morality and God with secular progressive pathologies that instead give them an alternative source of vision and meaning. They go by any number of terms, right? Climate alarmism, BLM or wokeism, radical gender ideology, whatever the form may be. But these dogmas, they're fundamentally impervious to factual debate or response. This is how you can get radical climate activists every 10 years saying that the earth is going to warm into oblivion. And then when it doesn't happen, just rinse and repeat and do the same thing again. It's because these are fundamentally political movements at their core. And all they do, they lack what core religious principles have, which is a belief in redemption and the possibility of salvation. And that makes them fundamentally incomplete. Because what they really serve as political movements is to divide us on the basis of our external characteristics, simply in the pursuit of raw political power. Because if you get past the base skin color differences that we may have, there is so much more that unites us as a people, regardless of whatever political party you may subscribe to. And so what's required to defeat these hollow, empty ideologies is a national revival based on the principles of our founding in 1776, based on the common set of purposes upon which we were created. That means our national motto is E pluribus unum, out of many, one. A respect for God, family, and country in that order. A pursuit of merit and excellence, not based on the color of your skin, but on the content of your character. You don't have to end up agreeing on every single aspect of public policy, but at least as a country, as a people, we should share some common set of values that we all comprehend and understand. But in order to have that type of a national revival at the local, state, and federal level, we at least have to understand the threats that we face. And so our history as a country is one of perpetual progress. It is absolutely true that one of our original sins as a country was slavery. But it is also true that we fought a war to end it, that we ensconced in our Constitution a prohibition against it, and that we ended legalized discrimination in the 1960s. That is not to say that our country is perfect, that every single flaw has been ironed out, but it is to say that endlessly focusing on individual instances of transgressions is fundamentally divisive to the country as a whole. There is not a single country, no society, no civilization that can survive if internally its core reason for being is systematically undermined at every turn. And where this has been most apparent is the division and the denigration of merit in lieu of diversity. The idea that individuals should be subservient to the collective goal, that instead of pursuing excellence, we should pursue diversity at all costs. And this form of critical theory, or more specifically critical race theory and its outspawns of DEI and ESG, are fundamentally divisive to our national interest. So critical race theory, you hear the term bandied about all the time. What it really comes down to is a simple belief that if there's any societal system that results in any racial disparity, even if there was no discriminatory intent involved, that system is by definition racist. Its outgrowth of diversity, equity, and inclusion, this Orwellian term, should really be called division, exclusion, and intolerance, because what it really subscribes to is a simple binary view of the world into oppressors and oppressed. This is how you can end up with neutral systems in our society like standardized testing, the scientific method, rational inquiry being labeled as bigoted aspects of white supremacy. This is how you can get people who are numerical minorities in the population but succeed through effort of their own hard work as somehow labeled as progenitors of this racism and white adjacent. How Asian Americans, who through their fault of doing well on standardized tests and academically, get labeled as white adjacent. How Jews, as a numerical minority, not just in our country, but globally as a whole, get labeled as colonizers and oppressed, thereby justifying violence against them. And by the same corollary, people who are underrepresented get labeled as perpetual victims, incapable of assisting themselves. But what is really pernicious about DEI is what it calls for. Because in requiring an equality of outcome, they have replaced the fundamental value of what it means to be equal, which used to mean equality of opportunity, but now means an equality of outcome. But in order to reach that, you have to discriminate on the basis of race. What could be more telling than suggesting the inference that basically to succeed in today's society, you have to be white or you have to be male? Frisco High School, and they're not alone in doing this. They recently had their students conduct what's called a privilege walk. So basically, if you were white or a male, you got to take a step forward. If you were black, if you were Muslim, if you were Hispanic, if you were Asian, you took a step backward. Imagine the level of self-loathing that would instill in the students who had to participate in that. Their friends from childhood somehow viewed as superior and their oppressors based on their external characteristics. And so that's what's really harmful. Mm-hmm. And so when you look at it, this kind of equity-based agenda, unfortunately, has infected every aspect of society, from college classrooms all the way to corporate boardrooms. Yeah. And it's because they've replaced a belief in merit with diversity. But their definition of diversity doesn't match what normal people would think of. We would think of, oh, this is a diverse group of people. We come together to collectively seek out and reach the truth. No, that's not what they believe. They believe in visual diversity only. That's how you can end up with 90% of the faculty lounges in Ivy League universities subscribing and registered to one political party. That's how you can have 90% of Google's political donations and from Silicon Valley going to one political party. Yeah. How Google's large language model seemingly is incapable of describing a white historical figure. They can't give a conservative argument in response to a prompt. That's because they have systematically downgraded the individual and merit in lieu of diversity. And where this has been most obviously seen and apparent is in affirmative action. From the 1970s through very recently, colleges and institutions of higher learning were allowed to expressly consider race and gender in determining their student body. You all are probably familiar that was recently challenged in a Supreme Court case, Students for Fair Admission versus Harvard and University of North Carolina. And I don't need to tell you what the result is, but I do want to spend a moment just describing what the facts of that case were so that you can understand in actuality how pernicious this equity-based agenda really is. Harvard admitted in their documents that they used race as a determinative tipping point and factor. They systematically gave Asian Americans lower personality scores in order to counterbalance their higher overall GPAs and testing scores. On average, there were about 400 points out of a 1,600-point test greater than other races. The balancing was so bad that an Asian American in the top 10% of their graduating class had effectively the same likelihood of acceptance as a black student in the bottom 40% of their class. In order to have that type of race-based preference, you necessarily, by elevating someone on the basis of an immutable external characteristic, college applications and jobs, they're zero-sum games. If one person advances, another person has to be put down for the exact same reason. And that is fundamentally unequal. And so the Supreme Court thankfully outlawed the use of racial consideration in higher education. But it's not over. We as a cause have to fight affirmative action in the use of race or gender-based quotas everywhere they exist in society. But we know that the proponents of DEI and ESG are going to fight tooth and nail to maintain their system of preferences because they think it aids them politically. Yeah. And so already in the wake of that decision, we've seen multiple aspects of society reorient to try to continue this discrimination. Colleges, most brazenly Columbia, in wake of the decision, they converted their essay prompt from a written one into a video. That way they could just see what the race and gender of the applicant was. They eventually retracted that in the face of public criticism. Rice, one of the most elite academic institutions in our state. Now their essay prompt expressly requests that applicants describe how their race affects their worldview. We've seen this impact curriculum. California has implemented something called equity-based math. I have no clue what that means. I assume that still means 2 + 2 is 4. But what it has actually meant is that calculus is not taught in many school districts in high school. That algebra, including in San Francisco ISD, the heart of Silicon Valley, is not taught at the middle school level. Why? Because the racial demographics of the students who are qualifying for that classwork doesn't match the preferences of the policymakers in that state. So rather than challenging the most talented and gifted students, we are dumbing down the curriculum for everyone. We've seen it in a move away from objective metrics. Stanford and other elite institutions have made the SAT and ACT optional. That's despite the fact that we know that standardized testing are the great equalizer for people who have means versus those who don't. You're all on the same playing field with the same number 2 pencil. And we know that by every study possible, that testing scores are a better predictor of your likely success in college and postgraduate life than your grades alone. And this farce, this idea that you can remove merit, can only last for so long, because slowly we've seen schools like Dartmouth and Yale and MIT start to reimpose these testing requirements. That's because if your role in society is to be an elite credentialing mechanism, which is essentially what these schools are, you have to graduate the best and brightest, or you're no longer valuable for your degree. We've seen this pollute medicine as well. If you know folks who are going through medical school, they typically have to take a 3-part licensing exam. Step 1 is typically taken during medical school. It's the broadest, it tests the broadest set of subject matters. And that numerical score is used to determine your place in competitive residencies and specialties. For years, it was based on a numerical score. Since 2022, the advice has been that it be graded on pass-fail. That means in future generations, when you seek medical care, it's likely to be substandard care by people who may or may not be qualified for the position. In corporate America, you've got BlackRock and other fund managers prioritizing DEI and ESG virtues rather than maximizing shareholder value. That's going to negatively impact the growth of pension funds and 401ks for retirees. But you've also seen companies adopt express racial and gender quotas. The CEO of United Airlines said that it is his goal for the company by 2030 to have 50% of the pilots on his airlines be female or people of color, as he calls them. That number today is 26%. That means over the course of the next 5 to 6 years, they need to double that number. That is mathematically impossible unless they lower the standards. There's not a single person, not Republicans, Democrats, independents, who cares what the color of the skin of the pilot is or what gender they are. We just hope that, God willing, in the event of an emergency, like a door flying off or needing to make an emergency landing in the Hudson, that they are at least competent and qualified to do so. And so the best way to challenge this divisive, racist ideology is to simply articulate a challenge to it. And we can't afford any longer to sit idly by as this cancer metastasizes, because it is deeply harmful to the national interest. And ironically, it crumbles upon even an ounce of scrutiny. Ibram Kendi, one of the progenitors of this idiotic anti-racist movement, he actually has a university center at Boston University. It was funded and created by Jack Dorsey, the former CEO of Twitter. He had to lay off recently 50% of his staff due to exploitation allegations. Professor Roland Fryer, the youngest tenured professor in the history of Harvard, who happens to be Black, published a seminal study in 2017 that showed that while there is some evidence to show that cops might use non-lethal force at higher rates against Black suspects, there is zero support to the proposition that cops use lethal force more likely against Black than others. That is completely contrary to the lies and the media narrative that somehow this is open season by cops on minorities. I'm not suggesting that every single cop interaction with suspects is above board. There are many that require investigation and potential discipline. But the actual facts are that orders of magnitude more cops are killed by armed suspects than the number of white and Black suspects are killed by cops. But for the great sin of just publishing data, of stating the truth, Roland Fryer was sidelined. He was placed on unpaid leave for 2 years on the basis of specious allegations that were completely unrelated to his research. Meanwhile, the president of the university who made that decision can't even condemn genocide before a congressional hearing.
Yeah.
This is the type of moral rot that is on full display at our quote-unquote elite institutions here in America for people to be able to make those decisions. And it's not just a systematic undermining of merit in this country. There's also been an attempt to devalue the role of parents and families in society. And so rather than every one of us, when we send our kids to school, we expect that they're going to learn reading, writing, arithmetic, and a basic contextual history of our country. We don't expect them to be exposed to obscene sexual content and indoctrination, like radical gender ideology, the idea that somehow your sex is fluid and that it can change. Science is clear. There's only two biological genders, just as it is true that life begins at conception. It is simply Orwellian to suggest that your sex is assigned at birth. It is assigned at conception. It is recognized at birth. And absolutely, gender dysphoria is a very real problem. It's a mental condition that deserves treatment and compassion and care. But affirming a delusion and making public policy on that basis, which negatively impacts our children, that is not compassion, that is cruelty. Our country is a tolerant and free one. You are free to live however you want in private, even if others disagree or find disagreement with it. That's fine, that's okay, we live in a free country. But tolerance is a two-way street, and it has to be reciprocated. But increasingly, what we seem to be having in society is a tyranny of the minority, where a committed group of individuals who subscribe to woke ideology are trying to cram their beliefs down on an unsuspecting public without any discussion of its ramifications in an effort to fundamentally change our society. And that's manifested itself with a reduction in the view of the role of parents in raising our children and the elevation of administrators and teachers as the final arbiters of our child's education. That is not what most parents, regardless of their background, actually believe. You've seen that, for instance, anti-transparency legislation has been passed in a number of states. In California, New Jersey, and others, teachers are legally prohibited by penalty of law from telling parents if their children asks to go by a different gender or pronoun in the classroom. You've seen a rise of obscene material. There are dozens of books in DISD. I'm confident that's the case here in Collin County and Denton as well, of books that are available to elementary school students that depict graphic instances of pornography and sexuality. We should have a basic expectation that when we send our kids to school that they're not going to be exposed to indecent material. Even public libraries have become a flashpoint. The American Library Association has tried to, and there are chapters here in Texas, they've tried to label basic efforts of parental rights and transparency as the equivalent of book banning, like Fahrenheit 451. The current leader of the American Library Association is a woman who's a self-described socialist. She has publicly said in speeches that she views public libraries as ground zero for a socialist revolution. These are the people who are curating the books available to our kids. And so we have to fight back against the mischaracterization of efforts at basic transparency as somehow the equivalent of a book ban. Nothing is being banned. The Supreme Court held 30 years ago that parents and administrators have the absolute legal right to determine the appropriate content that is age appropriate and free of obscenities in classrooms and in public places. You're free to purchase whatever you want on Amazon and Barnes & Noble or wherever you get your books. We're just asking that you not expose our kids to this type of material using our taxpayer dollars. And so what we've seen is instead of elevating excellence and a pursuit of merit, too often our kids are being exposed to indoctrination. And so the history of this country has been replete with instances of discrimination. We've had slavery. We've had the Japanese Americans unfairly interned in this country in concentration camps during World War II. We've had the Chinese Exclusion Act and other acts of inequity. But we've also had an enormous arc of progress. And all of that must and should be taught in its proper context. And so to the extent that there are still societal differences, there are often non-racial, completely valid explanations for them. Prior to the 1960s Great Society welfare programs, of which we're still dealing with the ruinous cost today, the black marital rate was higher than what it is today. In the 20 years prior to passage of those same legislation, the black middle class grew at a faster rate than it did in the 20 years afterwards, even after passage of the Civil Rights Act. And today you can draw a near direct inverse correlation between the lack of breakdown of nuclear families, the lack of fathers in the household, and the level of educational accomplishment and wealth accumulation. That is a relationship that holds across groups, bar none. But the real flaw and backdrop of DEI and ESG and equity policies is that not only are they most harmful to the people who they're supposed to protect, but that they prevent us as a society from accurately diagnosing and solving the problems that are at the root of many of our societal dysfunctions, which are the breakdown of the nuclear family and a conversion of our K through 12 public education system away from excellence and seeking merit, and instead one towards indoctrination and victimhood. The success sequence exists for a reason. For people who graduate high school, get a job, get married, and have kids in that order, their likelihood of ending up in poverty is reduced by over 80%. That's not to say that people can't succeed through other family arrangements. Of course not. It's simply to address an obvious common sense observation, which is that at least one of those methods is more likely to yield the preferred outcome. But for the great sin of recognizing what everyone knows to be true, it's seemingly verboten to say that out loud. But we have to have courage to speak the truth. There are too many in society today who just talk past one another. We seemingly have lost the ability to have free interactions with one another without judging each other for having different political points of view. And that's because political movements have replaced our foundational principles in public life, such that they seek to divide us on the basis of our external characteristics in the pursuit of raw political power. The days of being afraid of being called every ist and faux word in the dictionary, including ones that they make up tomorrow, they have to end, because DEI and ESG are contrary to our foundational principles. The Declaration of Independence posits that we are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, among them the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You are entitled to the pursuit of happiness. You are not entitled to an equality of outcome. The Constitution in our 5th and 14th Amendments prohibits and ensures equality under the law. It prohibits the type of discrimination and quotas that we see too often in today's society. All of our religious faiths, whatever your particular discipline or denomination may be, they collectively and almost universally teach us to treat each other as your brother's keeper, to treat others as you would like to be treated yourself. And so our national project has to be based on a return to our foundational principles to ensure a colorblind meritocracy. That begins by reestablishing self-governance in the home, locally, state, and at the federal level, ensuring that our kids are actually receiving an education, not being indoctrinated. We are not the descendants of a weak people. And I get to say we, just like everyone in this room, because America is singularly unique in that regardless when you came here, once you are an American, you are equal to everyone else who has been here for generations before you. There is not a single country on earth that gives you that same level of equal rights. Our founding fathers, our ancestors fought in Lexington and Concord for the Revolutionary War to give us freedom. They died on the battlefields of Gettysburg to preserve the Union. They marched in Selma to preserve civil rights all the way to present. We are not the descendants of weak people. We are not a nation of victims, and we should stop teaching our children and future generations that. We owe it to our children to at least ensure that they have a basic understanding and appreciation of the foundational principles that guided this country, so that future generations can receive the same blessings of liberty that we have. We owe it to our kids and our future as a nation. I appreciate your time. Thank you.